Imagine sending your child to school, trusting they're in safe hands, only to find they've been hurt in the most unthinkable way. Laura's story isn't just about a young girl. It's about a community fighting for justice, courage, and the power of standing up when something is deeply wrong. You won't believe what happened next. Welcome to our channel, where we share real stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us all of the power of courage. Today, we're bringing you Laura's journey, a story that exposes the strength of a family's love, a community's determination, and a young girl's unbreakable spirit. If you care about justice, resilience, and hope, stay tuned, because this story is one you won't forget. Laura had always loved her hair. It was curly, soft, and full of life, just like her. At 12 years old, she was a bright, kind-hearted girl in middle school who wore her hair proudly, reflecting the joy and confidence she carried inside. Her mother, who had lovingly nurtured her daughter's pride in her unique beauty, always reminded Laura, "Your hair is part of who you are. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Laura took these words to heart, even though sometimes her classmates or even teachers didn't quite understand. But Mrs. Kennedy, one of the strictest teachers in school, always seemed to have an issue with Laura. She was known for her no-nonsense approach to teaching, but with Laura, there was something more, an edge, a sharpness that other students didn't feel. Mrs. Kennedy often commented on Laura's distracting hair, urging her to keep it under control or do something about it. Laura would sit silently, holding back her anger and embarrassment, wishing Mrs. Kennedy could see her hair the way she and her family did, beautiful and natural. One day, the tension boiled over. During a math class, Mrs. Kennedy paused mid-lesson and addressed Laura sharply. "Laura, we've talked about this before. I told you to do something with that hair of yours. It's too big, too distracting." Laura, feeling the eyes of her classmates on her, softly replied, "It's just my hair, Mrs. Kennedy. I can't help it." Frustrated, Mrs. Kennedy's face grew red, and she directed Laura to follow her out of the classroom. Laura, confused and nervous, did as she was told. Mrs. Kennedy led her to an empty side room and closed the door, looking at her with a stern expression. "If you won't take care of that hair," she said, her tone cold and unfeeling, "then I will." Before Laura could process what was happening, Mrs. Kennedy pulled out a pair of scissors and a razor she kept hidden away. Laura tried to protest, but Mrs. Kennedy was determined, ignoring Laura's horrified expression and pleas. The sound of her curls falling to the floor filled Laura's ears, mingling with the shame and disbelief that paralyzed her. When it was over, Laura stood in the mirror, staring at a stranger. Her once beautiful hair was gone, reduced to stubble. She felt as though she'd lost a piece of herself. With trembling hands, she touched her scalp, feeling both the coldness of her skin and the unbearable weight of humiliation. Mrs. Kennedy, unmoved, simply said, "Now you can go back to class." Numb, Laura made her way home that afternoon, trying to avoid anyone's gaze. She kept a scarf tightly wrapped around her head, but as soon as she walked through the door, her mother noticed something was wrong. "Laura, baby, what happened?" her mother asked, gently lifting the scarf. Seeing her daughter's shaved head, she gasped, her heart breaking at the sight. Laura's mother hugged her daughter tightly, feeling a mixture of rage and helplessness. She couldn't understand how anyone, especially a teacher, could be so cruel. But one thing was clear. They couldn't let this go unanswered. "Laura," her mother whispered, her voice filled with determination, "we're going to make this right. I promise you." With her family's support behind her, Laura wiped her tears and stood a little taller. This was just the beginning of their fight for justice. Laura's mother couldn't let the cruelty her daughter had endured remain hidden. That night, filled with a mother's fierce love and determination, she wrote a post on social media, detailing everything that had happened. She described Laura's pride in her natural curls, the joy it brought her, and how it was snatched away by Mrs. Kennedy in a heartless act of control. She shared photos of Laura, both from before and after the incident, and called on the community to stand with them in demanding justice. Within hours, the post went viral. Thousands of people shared Laura's story, commenting with outrage and disbelief. "How could a teacher do something so cruel?" One person wrote. "This is beyond unacceptable," commented another. Support flooded in from across the country, with people demanding that the school take accountability. Hashtags like #JusticeForLaura and #ProtectOurChildren began to trend, and soon local news outlets were picking up the story. They interviewed Laura's mother, who held back tears as she described the heartbreak of seeing her daughter's shaved head, stripped of the pride and confidence she'd once had. As pressure mounted, the school finally responded, but their statement only fueled more anger. In a short post on their official page, the administration downplayed the incident, calling it a misunderstanding. They claimed Mrs. Kennedy had acted with the best intentions to enforce school grooming policies and described her as a dedicated teacher with years of service. The statement suggested that Laura's family was overreacting, as if they were inflating a small issue into a major scandal. Laura's mother read the school's response in disbelief. She felt betrayed and deeply hurt by the way the administration had dismissed her daughter's pain. It was as if they were saying that Laura's dignity, her self-respect, and the trauma she experienced didn't matter. That night, Laura's mother made a promise to herself. She would do whatever it took to make sure her daughter's voice was heard. The very next day, she contacted a lawyer, determined to take legal action against both Mrs. Kennedy and the school. The lawyer listened intently, appalled by the details of what had happened, and agreed to take on the case. As word spread, community members organized protests and rallies outside the school, carrying signs that read, "Justice for Laura," and "Stop Racism in Schools." The protests drew people of all ages and backgrounds, each person standing as a testament to the injustice Laura had suffered. Local activists joined, calling for stricter policies to protect students from discrimination and mistreatment. Meanwhile, Laura was struggling to cope. The incident had left her deeply scared. She couldn't bear to go to school, dreading the whispers, the pitying looks, and the stares from her classmates. She hid herself away, unwilling to face the world. The loss of her hair, something so personal and precious, felt like the loss of a piece of herself. She began to withdraw, her once bright spirit dimming under the weight of shame and confusion. Her family watched in pain as Laura retreated into herself. They tried to comfort her, but they knew that no words could undo what had been done. All they could do was stand by her, hoping that the legal fight would bring some measure of justice and show Laura that she was not alone. But in their hearts, they feared the lasting impact of Mrs. Kennedy's cruel actions and the school's refusal to acknowledge the harm that had been done. The community was rallying, the lawyers were preparing, and the family was bracing for a long fight. They knew this was just the beginning, but they refused to back down. For Laura's sake, and for every child who had been hurt in silence, they would fight. As Laura's case gained traction, her lawyer started digging deeper, determined to uncover every detail that could strengthen their fight for justice. The lawyer's investigation took an unexpected turn when they received an anonymous tip from a former student. The message hinted that Laura was not the first student Mrs. Kennedy had targeted. With a renewed focus, the lawyer reached out to past students and parents, hoping to uncover the truth behind Mrs. Kennedy's tenure. One by one, stories began to emerge. Former students recounted similar incidents of humiliation and strict, often demeaning, punishments, almost all of them targeting minority students. A young girl named Sarah spoke about how, years ago, Mrs. Kennedy had forced her to wear a correctional headband every day because her hair was too distracting. Another student, Jamal, shared that Mrs. Kennedy had singled him out, once making him sit at the back of the room because she felt his loud voice disrupted the class. Each testimony painted a clearer picture. Mrs. Kennedy had a long history of prejudice that she had hidden behind her role as a strict disciplinarian. The media quickly picked up on these revelations, and the story exploded. News outlets broadcast interviews with former students and parents who bravely shared their painful experiences. The town was shocked. People began to wonder how Mrs. Kennedy's behavior had gone unchecked for so long. Social media roared with outrage as people demanded accountability not just from Mrs. Kennedy, but from the school that had turned a blind eye. The school administration could no longer hide behind vague statements or dismissive responses. As pressure mounted, reporters uncovered internal documents that suggested the school had indeed been aware of Mrs. Kennedy's actions. Several complaints had been filed against her over the years, detailing her mistreatment of students. But instead of investigating, the school's administration had quietly dismissed each complaint, choosing to preserve the school's reputation rather than protect its students. This revelation hit the public hard, sparking widespread outcry. People were furious, questioning how many children had suffered because of the school's indifference. Parents and community members who had once trusted the school now felt betrayed. The story shifted from being about a single teacher's cruelty to exposing a broken system that had allowed this injustice to persist. Under immense pressure and facing the potential collapse of their reputation, the school administration finally suspended Mrs. Kennedy. They announced a full investigation into the incidents that had surfaced, promising to look into every complaint and take action against any staff involved in covering up the abuse. But the damage was done. The community's trust had been shattered, and the administration's reputation lay in ruins. Meanwhile, Mrs. Kennedy faced her own downfall. With the investigation underway, her awards and recognitions were stripped, and the respect she'd once commanded in the community evaporated. As more former students came forward, it became clear that her actions were rooted in deep-seated biases, which she had concealed under the guise of discipline and strictness. Parents were horrified, realizing that the person they had trusted to educate their children had instead inflicted pain and shame on so many. The town collectively recoiled as they realized the extent of the harm Mrs. Kennedy had caused. The truth was devastating. Mrs. Kennedy's actions had scarred children, leaving many of them with lingering trauma. The school's failure to act had only deepened these wounds, allowing an environment of prejudice and harm to fester. As more stories emerged, the once hidden pain became visible for all to see. The public's demand for justice was no longer just about Laura. It was about every child who had suffered in silence. For the community, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that blind trust in authority can sometimes lead to the worst kind of harm. For Laura's family, it was both a victory and a heartbreaking revelation, knowing their fight had exposed a pattern of abuse, but at the cost of so many children's innocence. Mrs. Kennedy, once respected and even admired, was left isolated and publicly condemned. Her reign over her classroom was over, and her downfall was swift and irreversible. But for Laura and the many others who had been wronged, the journey to healing was only just beginning. The day Laura's family received news of their legal victory was one of mixed emotions. After a long and painful battle, they had finally won. The school was forced to pay damages to Laura's family and issue a public apology, acknowledging the harm done to Laura and the other students who had suffered under Mrs. Kennedy. It wasn't just a victory for Laura. It was a victory for every child who had been mistreated and silenced. In the aftermath of the trial, Mrs. Kennedy was fired and permanently banned from teaching. The consequences rippled through the entire school district, which was now under intense scrutiny for its role in covering up years of complaints. Policies were revised, and new oversight committees were established to prevent such incidents from happening again. Across the nation, Laura's story sparked discussions about accountability, the importance of diversity and respect, and the need to protect children's rights. The entire country seemed to pause and consider the impact of unchecked authority and the necessity of speaking up against injustice. For Laura, however, the journey to healing was only beginning. Though justice had been served, the trauma of her experience lingered, leaving her feeling vulnerable and shaken. Yet she was not alone. Her family wrapped her in love and support, ensuring she felt safe and valued. Community organizations and activists who had supported her from the start reached out, offering mentorship, therapy, and resources to help her rebuild her confidence and sense of self-worth. Through therapy, Laura slowly began to open up, confronting the pain she had endured and learning to see herself beyond the cruelty of Mrs. Kennedy's actions. Local organizations connected her with role models, strong, compassionate individuals who shared stories of resilience in the face of discrimination. Laura's scars, both visible and invisible, gradually began to heal as she found strength in her community and the love surrounding her. As the months passed, Laura's confidence started to blossom once more. She learned to embrace her beauty again, allowing her hair to grow freely, a symbol of her resilience and pride. Inspired by her experience, Laura began to speak out against discrimination. She visited schools, shared her story, and encouraged other students to be proud of who they were. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying a wisdom that belied her years. She had gone from being a victim of injustice to a young advocate for equality and respect, determined to make sure no one else would have to endure what she had. Laura's mother, who had stood up for her daughter with unwavering determination, was often approached by other parents, each thanking her for being brave enough to fight not only for Laura, but for all children who had ever felt voiceless. Laura's story became a lasting message, a testament to the power of standing up against injustice and the courage it takes to fight for what's right. She had endured something no child should have to face, but she had come out of it wiser, stronger, and more determined to make the world a better place. Her journey was a reminder that change begins with one voice willing to speak out, and that with love, resilience, and support, even the deepest wounds can heal. Laura's story made me cry. I know how most girls and women adore and cherish their hair, their crown. When last did you or your child experience something ugly? How did you stand up for yourself or child? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Like, share the video, and subscribe.